morning. Good morning. It is my great pleasure and honor to serve as your keynote speaker today. I want to thank everyone for the warm reception and hospitality I have received while visiting campus. Thank you to the University of Missouri St. Louis and to all the organizations and individuals whose efforts made today possible. I have up here a quote from Dr. King, which I thought was significant because even though we are now 51 years removed from the time of Dr. King, and even though it has now become this national holiday where we gather together and celebrate, and even though we have monuments and many honorifics to Dr. King, I think it is important to remember that a major part of nonviolent protest, the Gandhian and Kingian nonviolent protest, was disruption, right? It was about peace, but about the fact that peace could not exist in the absence of justice, and that it was not simply enough to cooperate or to participate in good, but to actively refuse to cooperate in the perpetuation of evil. Let's see if my clicker's working. Yes, wonderful. On August 6, 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed into law the Voting Rights Act. It was a key piece of civil rights legislation which King had pressed the federal government to pass as a measure of protection against long-standing efforts to deny black voters access to the ballot at the state and local level. For King, the bill was the culmination of the prolonged struggles in Alabama and Mississippi. Upon signing it, Johnson proclaimed that, quote, "Today we strike away the last major shackles of fierce and ancient bonds." 5 days later, a riot erupted in Watts, a black and impoverished neighborhood within Los Angeles. Most of the people who lived in Watts were descendants of the mass migration that occurred during the 20th century, as thousands of black Americans fled oppression and terror in the South, only to encounter police violence and housing discrimination in the West and in the North. The Watts Rebellion was one of several that occurred that year. For King, these events were a reminder that no amount of civil rights legislation passed during the 1960s on its own would be enough to resolve the complex and multi-layered systems of discrimination and oppression which confine the majority of black Americans to generational poverty and a drastically diminished quality of life. In his final book, written in 1967, entitled "Where Do We Go From Here? Community or Chaos?" King makes it clear that the enactment of certain civil rights legislation was only one part of what he assumed would be a prolonged struggle. King wrote, quote, "With Selma and the Voting Rights Act, one phase of development in the civil rights revolution came to an end. A new phase opened, but few observers realized it or were prepared for its implications. For the vast majority of white Americans, the past decade, the first phase, had been a struggle to treat the Negro with a degree of decency, not of equality. White America was ready to demand that the Negro should be spared the lash of brutality and coarse degradation, but it had never been truly committed to helping him out of poverty, exploitation, or all forms of discrimination. While the popular historical narrative that has been crafted since that time would have us believe that the civil rights movement concluded and was complete, that the evidence of its completion is the desegregation of buses, the integration of schools, and the civil rights legislation it spawned. The reality is that the assassination of King marked the interruption of a movement. King was in the middle of organizing the Poor People's Campaign and assisting sanitation workers striking in Memphis, Tennessee, when he was gunned down by a white supremacist while exiting his hotel room. King is most famously remembered for the speech he delivered at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. While most are familiar with the "I Have a Dream" portion of his speech, far fewer are aware of the list of demands that accompanied that march. The #1 demand read as follows: comprehensive and effective civil rights legislation from the present Congress without compromise or filibuster to guarantee all Americans access to all public accommodations, decent housing, adequate and integrated education, and the right to vote. Of the issues listed in that first demand, the only one that we are not still marching and protesting and organizing and petitioning to achieve is access to public accommodations. And even though public facilities can no longer legally refuse service on the basis of race, in cities and towns throughout the nation, de facto segregation is still the norm. In my hometown of Charlotte, North Carolina, which was at one point lauded for its efforts to integrate its educational institutions, students now attend public schools that are as economically and racially segregated as they were prior to the end of Jim Crow. Indeed, in cities and towns throughout the nation, systemic racism still operates full force to ensure that the majority of Black Americans live in small enclaves of concentrated poverty, where very few of the residents own their place of dwelling. The right to vote is far from secured, as those who oppose the idea of a multiracial, inclusive America maneuver tirelessly to undermine democracy at every turn and to devise new ways of denying people access to the ballot. In consideration of all of this, I would put forth that in addition to the MLK holiday being a time of service and remembrance, it should also be a time when we pause for reflection and perform an assessment of where we are as a nation relative to the aspirations of the civil rights movement. Each year when we gather in this way to admire the dream of Dr. King, it's incumbent upon us to examine how and why that dream is not yet a reality. We must then ask ourselves, what are we actively doing to make it a reality? While there are many indicators one can point to as evidence that race relations have improved since the time of King, many pointed to the election of the nation's first Black president as the definitive sign. The truth is that we betray the legacy of King if we fail to examine why. 50 years after what King described as the Negro Revolution of 1963, we saw a new revolution emerge as young Black and brown youth rose up to declare that their lives mattered. I was one of those young people moved to action in 2013. A confluence of events that summer sparked a deeper awakening of my socio-political consciousness as I, like many others, witnessed the racist backlash to the election of Barack Obama and the demographic changes occurring in the United States. I feel in many ways that events in my home state of North Carolina have presaged recent national events. You see, in 2008, North Carolina's electoral votes went to a Democratic candidate for the first time since the end of the Civil Rights Movement. And in response, extremist neo-Confederate Republicans overtook the state legislature in 2010 and immediately set about identifying and undoing all the things that had made the election of a Black man possible. This included a meticulous plan to target and disenfranchise poor Black and student voters. White supremacists in North Carolina were aided in their efforts by the United States Supreme Court when it struck down key parts of the Voting Rights Act in 2013, stripping the law of all its teeth before it had reached its 50th anniversary. My parents raised me to operate with an awareness of Black history and of the struggles that were undertaken for me to enjoy the freedoms I have. I was told of my third great-grandparents, Theodore and Minerva Diggs, who were enslaved on a plantation in Rembrandt, South Carolina, where, according to my third great-grandmother, she prayed every night that her children would see freedom. I was imbued with a sense of duty and responsibility to be the best I could personally be, to honor the sacrifices of past generations who were denied such opportunity. The overall message I received from the adults around me was that my ancestors had struggled so that I would not have to. Others had protested and had been arrested and beaten and had risked their lives so that I wouldn't have to. Yet in 2013, I, like many young black people in America, recognized that no amount of education or hard work or good behavior or money could place us beyond the reaches of systemic racism. I saw how quickly civil rights legislation could be undone and how determined white supremacists were to roll the clock back to the 1950s, to the time before the Brown v. Board of Education ruling. I became involved with the Moral Monday protest movement organized by the Reverend Dr. William Barber II and the North Carolina State Chapter of the NAACP. Along with a group of students and young adults, I helped plan a sit-in at the North Carolina State House protesting this effort to suppress votes. Our sit-in, which occurred in the summer of 2013, was also a show of solidarity with the Dream Defenders, a Black and Latinx youth-led organization based in Florida. At that time, the Dream Defenders were engaged in a month-long sit-in at the Florida State House to protest the acquittal of George Zimmerman, the criminalization of black youth, and the Stand Your Ground gun laws, which had legalized the murder of Trayvon Martin. A 17-year-old, unarmed black teenager walking in the neighborhood where he lived had been profiled, stalked, accosted, shot, and killed in an act of vigilante violence that's painfully familiar to African Americans. And his killer had been arrested only after 6 weeks of intense national protest. For many of us, the case evoked visions of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old African-American teenager from Chicago who was lynched while visiting family in Mississippi and whose racist killers were acquitted of their crimes. The lynching of Emmett Till would prove to be a major catalyst in the birth of the civil rights movement. And similarly, the case of Trayvon Martin would end up igniting a new movement led by black and brown youth across the nation who saw themselves in Trayvon. Millennial activist groups sprang up everywhere. As we continued to organize and build youth and student power in the South, police brutality quickly became the forefront issue of our work, as cell phone cameras and social media networks made it no longer possible to ignore or to deny the frequency of police violence in America. In the same summer that we protested at the state houses, a young black man named Jonathan Farrell crashed his car in a neighborhood in Charlotte, North Carolina. When he knocked on doors seeking help, a resident called the police, who arrived shortly thereafter. Upon seeing Jonathan, a white police officer shot him 12 times in the chest and killed him. A series of back-to-back high-profile police killings of unarmed black men the following year reached a boiling point when an unarmed black teenager named Michael Brown was shot and killed by a white police officer in a place where black citizens had been routinely harassed by cops to generate revenue for the city coffers. Brown's body was left on display in the street for hours, a show of total disregard for his life, and the officer involved was not arrested. When residents objected, police responded with K-9 units, rifles, tanks, and tear gas. From around the nation, people mobilized to join the residents of St. Louis in their resistance. The uprising marked a moment of awakening as we looked upon the conditions here and saw that Ferguson is everywhere. In Charlotte, I began organizing with a collective to prepare for what we considered the inevitable day such an event would occur in our city. The United States witnessed at least one major urban uprising each year for 3 consecutive years. In 2015, Baltimore erupted in the wake of the Freddie Gray killing, and in 2016, the killing of Keith Lamont Scott by CMPD sparked a weeks-long uprising in my home city of Charlotte, as we predicted when someday happened. We saw an uptick in violence against black churches during this time as well. It was in 2015 that we learned the Trayvon Martin case had not only inspired a new generation of young freedom fighters, but also the young white supremacist who entered Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, to shoot and kill 9 black parishioners during a prayer meeting. In his racist manifesto that surfaced after the killings, Dylan Roof wrote, quote, "The event that truly awakened me was the Trayvon Martin case." Of course, there's a long history of racist violence aimed at Black churches, specifically because of their historic role as hubs of Black community organization and the vital role Black churches have played in the ongoing civil rights movement. Roof targeted Mother Emanuel specifically for this reason. He traveled to Charleston from Columbia, South Carolina, where since 1961, a Confederate flag had flown above the state capitol as a statement of white supremacist power, as a symbol of defiance against the civil rights movement and increasing pressure from the federal government to desegregate. Being a child of the South myself and descended from a family that has been in the Carolinas for hundreds of years, the meaning of the Confederate flag and the social order it represented was never lost on me. South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union, arguing that, quote, "we of the South contend that slavery is right." The Confederacy was formed in the belief that African Americans should remain in a perpetual state of bondage. And so the Confederate flag was a banner that first represented slavery, and then, after the South lost the war, it became emblematic of the Jim Crow laws which would govern the South for the next 100 years. Laws undergirded by a culture of racial terror whereby Black people could be murdered simply for attempting to vote. Like many Black families in the South, my own has experienced this violence. My great uncle, who was lynched in Goldsboro, North Carolina, so a white man could take his newspaper stand. Or my grandmother, who as a child in Greenville, South Carolina, witnessed the Ku Klux Klan drag her neighbor from his house and beat him in the middle of the street simply because he was a Black doctor who had provided treatment to a white woman. And though the trauma of such events has led to a climate where we don't discuss these events openly or often, it is the pervasive threat of such violence that made the Confederate flag in Columbia, South Carolina seemingly untouchable for so many years. While there had been many protests regarding the flag, including a boycott led by the NAACP, and although the state continually suffered loss of business due to its display, the flag remained in place, an ominous symbol hovering above the South Carolina Capitol, a constant source of ire and pain for all those who lived in the region and have experienced the oppression the ideology of the flag represents. In the year 2000, the State House relented slightly and agreed to move the flag from the dome of the Capitol, where it was originally raised at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, to the Capitol lawn. At that time, they took a number of measures to further protect the flag, including passing a law that forbade the flag to be lowered for any reason unless there was a 2/3 approval from the State House. The state even erected a 4-foot-tall spoked fence around the flag to protect it, and designed it to have an internal pulley system to prevent anyone from taking it down. Protests over the flag continued, yet state leaders, including the governor at the time, Nikki Haley, refused to address the issue further until, of course, the horrific events in Charleston. So much blood has been spilled in the fight for racial justice up to this point. And tragically, shamefully, it took the blood of 9 more innocent people to finally shake the conscience of this nation surrounding that symbol of slavery, hatred, and terrorism that is the Confederate flag. As long as I live, I will never forget the night of the Charleston Massacre. It shook me to my core that here we were in 2015 and this level of racial hatred and terrorism was still happening in America. I will never forget the day after when, like many cities around the nation, we held a vigil for the victims and survivors of the massacre at a local AME church with its own history of involvement in the ongoing civil rights movement. I remember being asked by a reporter that night what I thought the next steps were, and my honest answer was that I didn't know. To be honest, as a Christian, I experienced a personal crisis of faith at that moment. Those whose lives were taken in Emmanuel AME Church that night: Cynthia Hurd, Susie Jackson, Ethel Lance, DePayne Middleton Doctor, Tawanza Sanders, Daniel Simmons, Sharonda Coleman Singleton, Myra Thompson, and Clementa Pinckney, rest in peace. They were only doing what Christians are called to do when anyone knocks on the doors of the church, which is to invite them into fellowship and worship. The trauma of it all was exacerbated by events that had taken place in the preceding months. When in North Charleston, a white police officer was caught on video murdering Walter Scott by shooting him in the back as he ran away. The officer then attempted to plant evidence on his body. Clementa Pinckney, the pastor of Mother Emanuel, was also a state senator who just days before being gunned down in his own church had succeeded in getting body camera legislation passed in the state in response to the Walter Scott case. A sense of shock and demoralization overtook the movement. The United States and South Carolina state flag. Due to the law enacted in 2000, the Confederate flag remained high and fully unfurled even as the casket of Clementa Pinckney was processed through the streets of Columbia, South Carolina. The message being sent that day was clear, and one and the same as when the all-white legislature first raised the flag in 1961. As photos surfaced of Dylann Roof burning the American flag while waving the Confederate flag, there was a renewed sense of outrage over the state's continued endorsement of this hate symbol. By this point, I had become an organizer in my local community, and I had no specific intentions of getting arrested again at the time. I had promised my parents. But I determined that an action to take down the flag was a cause for which I would definitely risk getting arrested again. And I was so deeply convicted on the issue that I had seriously contemplated attempting to climb myself, having no real climbing experience. It was actually a Greenpeace activist from New York who had experience scaling trees, who trained me on how to do it over a course of a couple of days. That's just how strongly I felt about it. That even if I could just go down there and try to hop over the fence and be arrested in the attempt, that the statement needed to be made how absolutely intolerable the situation was. I scaled the flagpole on Saturday, June 27th, 2015. And it was at a meeting the Tuesday evening before the action that I met many of my cohorts in the action for the first time, including James Tyson, who demonstrated great moral courage when he helped me across the fence and stood guard as I climbed. In fact, as I neared the top of the flagpole, up until that point there were two officers at the bottom, and we were having this conversation back and forth. They're obviously telling me to stop what I'm doing and to come down, and I'm communicating to them this is a nonviolent action, I'm going to get the flag, I'm prepared to be arrested when I come down, and that's the extent of it. Well, during that time, a supervisor came over, and as I was nearing the top, he directed the officers at the bottom to tase me. Now, being attached to a metal pole with metal clasp and having 3 tasers trained on me, had they shot me full of electricity, there's a possibility that I could have been electrocuted. And it was at that time that James grabbed the pole. If you have seen any of the video or footage, you might see where James is holding onto the pole as I'm coming down, and that's because he refused to let go. He said to them, if you electrocute her, you'll have to electrocute me too. And then others who were gathered around at the bottom began shouting, and that is when they backed away. History will rightly remember him alongside the many white allies who over the centuries have risked their own safety and in some cases spilled their own blood in defense of black life and in the name of freedom. It was with this awareness of history that we chose to attack a symbol of systemic racism with a direct action that symbolized its dismantling. We discussed it and decided to remove the flag immediately, both as an act of civil disobedience and as a demonstration of the power people have when we work together. We couldn't wait for South Carolina to do the right thing. We had been waiting for South Carolina to do the right thing for over 100 years regarding racial justice and equality. In 1963, King penned a letter while jailed in Birmingham and explained the need for nonviolent direct action to, quote, create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community that has consistently refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. That was our goal with this action. By removing the flag, we would force the state of South Carolina into a moral crisis of making the choice whether to leave the flag down or to raise it back up. Of course, in the immediate aftermath, they raised it back up and then officially lowered it 2 weeks later. But achieving this action would require many roles, including, of course, someone who must volunteer to scale the pole and remove the flag. The first practical question we have to consider when we engage in any action that might lead to arrest is, who is in a position to be arrested, to put themselves at that risk, and who was physically able to scale the pole in this manner? That ended up narrowing it down to 3 of us who were gathered there that Tuesday evening. And among those 3, we were all women, and I was the only person of color. And in consideration of my ancestral connection to South Carolina, we recognized the powerful image that would be created in people witnessing a black woman remove the Confederate battle flag in South Carolina. So after I volunteered, and it was clear that this role would be going to me, we talked through the symbolism of the action as a group and collectively decided that a white man should volunteer to help me over the fence, stand guard as I climb, and volunteer to be arrested alongside of me, putting his own body on the line in a display of racial and gender solidarity. As I scaled the flagpole, my climb would represent the centuries-long struggle to dismantle white supremacist systems. And James's presence would serve as a reminder that the work of dismantling racism cannot be the labor of the oppressed alone, but must be actively undertaken by those who benefit from the perpetuation of racist policies. And we made this decision because for us, this is not, nor has it ever simply been about a flag, but about abolishing the spirit of hatred and oppression in all its forms. I bring everything I have to the cause of freedom. It's a conscious choice I have made to dedicate myself to the causes of democracy and liberation, even to the point of putting my own body on the line. Why? Because I have examined what's at stake for me if I don't. But perhaps even more than that, I've examined the past and asked, what was at stake each time Harriet Tubman risked her life going south to usher more souls into freedom? What was at stake when Gandhi was tossed from a train in South Africa and had to make a decision whether to accept that treatment or to protest? Where would we be today were it not for those who recognized what was at stake in the times in which they lived? Where would we be today if it were not for those who analyze and ask themselves, what can I do to make a change in this moment? When I ask what is at stake in this moment, I also consider the future. I ask, what am I doing as an individual? What gifts, what talents, what skills, what resources, what time am I contributing to the collective effort to better humanity? In 1968, King said, we must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. This transformation King describes that we must undergo as a society is the process of decolonization. He doesn't use that term that is commonly used now, but that's what he's describing. Many people think colonialism is over, but since there has never been a real process of reparation and reconciliation regarding the legacy of colonialism and slavery, the reality is that European colonialism and the ideology of white supremacy that informed it has simply evolved into a more highly organized and complex system. Modern colonialism or neocolonialism looks like what I see in my community in Charlotte, North Carolina, where those who perform the labor of making the city operable struggle to survive and thrive there. Colonialism today looks like people being systematically funneled out of their communities into a prison system that profits from using them as cheap, invisible labor for the military-industrial complex and to create products that we use every day. It looks like Puerto Ricans being saddled with debt and then left to die following a natural disaster. It looks like Native peoples still enduring the legacy of forced displacement, broken treaties, and manufactured poverty. It looks like government workers being deprived of pay, their families and their local communities thrown into economic uncertainty for the sake of erecting a wall that is essentially a monument to racism at the southern border. That said, it is not possible for us to uncolonize ourselves because we cannot undo history. We cannot undo the process that has resulted in all of us being here in this moment, that has resulted in me being here today speaking to you in this English language as a descendant of the enslaved and the enslaver. We can only decolonize, that is, to consciously dismantle within society and within ourselves the destructive ideologies and practices of colonialism that we have internalized as a result of our having been colonized. This is a time of great turmoil. You turn on the news and much of what you see are images of violence and unrest. And the most consistent message seems to be one of fear. Turmoil isn't something we have to fear, however. Turmoil is an indication that the ground is ripe for sowing the seeds of social change. Every period of awakening and advancement in human history has been marked by this kind of turmoil, and it's true that the darkest hour is right before dawn. So I embrace this as a time of transformation and promise. It's a blessing to volunteer and organize at a grassroots level in my community where I witness the kind of cooperation, innovation, and courage that springs to life when people work together for the betterment of all. It's important that when we give of ourselves, that we do it with an understanding of service leadership. That leadership is first and foremost about service and sacrifice for others. And that giving is first and foremost about grace. Folks often speak in terms of this modern movement being a leaderless movement. But it's more accurate to describe it as leaderful. There's a common belief in shared leadership and collective responsibility. Everyone can help lead the way toward a just society. Everyone carries with them skills, talents, knowledge, and experience that is valuable to this world. And everyone can apply what they have to the cause of justice. I often get the question, what can I do? People witness these daily injustices and societal illnesses and sometimes feel powerless and overwhelmed by it all. One doesn't have to be a frontline activist in the traditional sense of the word to be impactful. I think there's this common perception that unless you are doing something as dramatic as scaling a flagpole, you are not an activist. If you are not being tear gassed or chased down by dogs, you are not part of the effort. Now, civil disobedience and public protest are essential to achieving democracy. They always have been. I believe that they always will be. But my point is that justice doesn't come only in the streets. As a community organizer, I don't need everyone in the community to do what I do. I need them to bring what they have to the effort. I need teachers, I need lawyers, I need doctors, I need social workers. We need people in institutions that were designed to oppress, to occupy the institution and transform it from the inside out and from the root to the tip. Person has within them the power to be a change maker. We need all hands on deck, people in every field and from every walk of life. Everyone must ask themselves what is at stake in these times. It's also very important that we not allow purpose to get lost in process. What I mean by that is that sometimes we can get so caught in the back and forth of how we do something that we forget why we're doing it. We can get so caught up on models and statistics and methods and abstract theories that we lose sight of a basic humanity. Ultimately, the root of our social ills is a question of what does it mean to be human? How does our understanding of what it means to be human inform the way in which we order our society? How does our understanding of what it means to be human inform the way in which we interact with others? In terms of where we go from here in the continued struggle for social justice, I believe it is crucial that we recognize both the systemic and global nature of racial injustice. We have to, as King urged, move towards a human rights framework which recognizes the struggle for racial justice in America as being part of a universal struggle for education, housing, democracy, and equal protection under the law. We must address the wealth inequality that exists from centuries of racial oppression and economic exploitation. We must address the systemic injustice that brings generational poverty to cities and rural communities alike, that brings police brutality to Baltimore, to Palestine, to the favelas of Brazil. I've been praised a lot for my courage. But I want to point out that courage is not about the absence of fear. I would argue that fearlessness and courage are not actually the same thing, because if you lack fear, you have no need for courage. Courage is not about the absence of fear, but rather the belief in something greater than that fear and the determination to fight for it. Courage is rooted in faith. I faced tremendous fear when I volunteered to climb the flagpole in South Carolina. I returned to my house after that initial meeting and prayed maybe more deeply and more fervently than I ever have. And in that moment, I felt connected to past freedom fighters on another level. I thought especially of the Freedom Riders, of those young people who boarded buses and traveled south in deliberate violation of segregation laws. I thought of the courage it took for them to make that journey, not knowing what would greet them or if they would even return alive. It was leaning on my faith in God, leaning on the memory of my ancestors and the faith they had to exercise in the times through which they lived. That's what gave me the courage to do what I did. You see, I understood the risk involved in what I was doing. I understood there was reason to fear what might happen. Yet I also understand that as a human being, the measure of my humanity is linked to my ability to recognize the humanity of others. I knew that I had become part of something so much greater than myself. And that is the universal struggle of humanity toward a society that is truly free and that truly recognizes the rights of all individuals. This is the cause greater than myself that I risked my life for that day and that I continue to fight for. King is quoted as saying, "If you haven't found something you're willing to die for, you aren't fit to live." Now, this quote is not an instruction to go and find a reason to die, right? But rather to be very clear about what is it that you're living for. Do you live solely in the pursuit of material things and temporary pleasures? Or do you see your life as being tied together? Let us recognize in this moment that this question is not to be posed to those who are living 51 years from now, but to those of us who are living today. Because it is we, in this moment, with the actions we choose now, who will chart the course of the next half century. Each of us must examine ourselves and ask, what will be my contribution? Where will I jump in to help humanity lift itself up? How will my presence positively impact the course of history for future generations? Ask this of yourself. Answer it for yourself. And I pray that you have the courage to act on your convictions. Thank you.